From the moment her hull became hidden beneath the waters of the Java Sea, USS Langley ceased to be merely a naval experiment and transformed into a silent symbol of an irreversible change in maritime history. The disappearance of that ship not only represented the loss of the first American aircraft carrier, but also the abrupt end of an era of innovation that had begun with doubts, criticism, and risky bets within the Navy itself. What many forgot over time is that the Langley did not emerge as a perfect machine or as a promised triumph. It was born as a desperate attempt to get ahead of a military reality that was evolving at an implacable speed. Every screw, every plank of its wooden deck, every electrical cable that powered its propulsion system was part of a monumental gamble to prove that the future of naval warfare would not lie in cannons, but in the air. One of the most fascinating factors in the history of the Langley is the institutional resistance it faced. Many high-ranking naval officials believed that airplanes could never replace the range and precision of naval artillery. For them, the great battleships were still the kings of the ocean, and they could not conceive of the idea of a floating platform carrying fragile machines that depended on weather, wind, and unreliable engines. However, a small group of visionaries understood what was coming, that aerial mobility would allow attacks beyond the horizon, surprise the enemy, and redefine global maritime strategy. The Langley became the testing ground where those still immature ideas began to take shape. There, on her deck, they learned to live with the constant risk of fatal accidents, to coordinate dozens of men in synchronized movements, to handle volatile fuel near red-hot engines, and to bring damaged or uncontrollable aircraft back aboard. The first pilots who operated from the Langley experienced something completely different from any other air branch. Flying from land offered space, margin for error, and stable surfaces. In contrast, taking off from Langley's deck meant facing a tiny space, a runway that moved to the rhythm of the waves, wind that changed direction abruptly, and the real possibility of ending up in the water in a matter of seconds. Those men repeated a phrase that would later become part of aircraft carrier folklore. There are only two kinds of naval pilots, those who have already fallen into the sea and those who soon will. Every operation was a test of nerves, a dance between human precision and natural forces. And little by little, the crew found ways to improve, to refine procedures, to turn chaos into routine, until they achieved milestones that surprised even those who had doubted the project. During her years of service before the war, the Langley functioned as a floating academy. Dozens of pilots who would later lead squadrons on legendary aircraft carriers began their careers there. Many of them remembered with a mixture of nostalgia and respect the endless training days, the failed landings, the celebrations of first successes, and the camaraderie that developed in an environment where danger was constant. At night, the crew would gather in small spaces, talking about the future of naval aviation, without imagining that, barely 2 decades later, aircraft carriers would completely dominate the war in the Pacific. What began as an experiment became the backbone of the United States Navy. But the history of the Langley cannot be understood solely from the perspective of technological progress. It is also marked by human sacrifice and strategic decisions that, although necessary, had devastating consequences. When World War II broke out, the Langley was no longer considered suitable for direct combat. Her capabilities had been surpassed by larger, faster, and better armed carriers. Instead of retiring her, the Navy decided to assign her one last role, transporting crucial aircraft to reinforce Allied defense on a front that was collapsing rapidly. That voyage to Java was a desperate mission, an attempt to contain the Japanese advance that seemed unstoppable. The Langley carried not only aircraft, but strategic hopes. Each P-40 she transported represented a chance for resistance, a possibility of slowing a brutal offensive. As she advanced through dangerous waters, intelligence reports indicated that Japanese air superiority in the region was overwhelming. The personnel on board knew they were entering a zone where attacks could occur at any moment. The tension was palpable in the ship's corridors, in the engine room, on the flight deck. The Army pilots traveling as passengers had no control over their fate. They depended entirely on the protection of the ship and her escorts. Some hurriedly wrote letters to their families, aware that they might not have another opportunity. Others tried to remain optimistic, convinced that they would reach their destination and enter combat. None imagined that their journey would end abruptly and tragically before even touching land. When Japanese bombers appeared in the sky on February 27, 1942, they did so with lethal precision. The Langley was a slow target, with little maneuverability and no real capacity to defend herself against a coordinated air attack. The first failed attacks generated a brief sense of hope, but that relief vanished in seconds when a wave of bombs fell directly on the ship. The impact was devastating. The deck became a hell of fire and twisted metal. The fuel stores ignited immediately, and the machinery was rendered useless. The crew fought bravely, trying to contain the disaster, but the flames spread too quickly. With the ship listing, without power, and with internal explosions shaking her structure, the decision to abandon her was inevitable. Survivor accounts describe a chaotic and painful scene. Many had to throw themselves into the water among burning debris, dodging metal fragments and floating fuel slicks. Some attempted to save equipment or important documents, but soon realized that the absolute priority was survival. The escorting destroyers carried out risky maneuvers to rescue the men in the water while bombs continued to fall. The rescued watched helplessly as their ship, that symbol of the birth of American naval aviation, slowly sank. For many, it was like watching a part of their life disappear. The Langley was not just steel and wood. It was the place where they had learned, worked, and risked everything. When she finally disappeared beneath the waves, she left behind no visible monuments or floating remains to mark her grave. The ocean consumed her completely, and thus began the long silence of 75 years. The history after her sinking became a mixture of uncertainty, frustration, and myth. For years, official records offered little clarity. Some reports suggested that the Langley had remained partially afloat for hours before sinking. Others claimed she had exploded completely beneath the surface. There were even rumors among sailors that the Japanese had captured part of the crew, something that was never verified. The only certainty was that after the attack, the United States Navy faced devastating losses in Southeast Asia. Bases fell one after another. Fleets were destroyed or forced to withdraw, and control of the sea seemed to slip through their fingers. In the midst of that storm, investigating what happened to the Langley simply was not a priority. The war demanded immediate answers, new strategies and resources, not detailed investigations about a lost ship. Thus, her memory slowly faded, relegated to classified reports and the nostalgia of those who had served on her. As the world moved toward larger and more decisive battles, such as Midway, Guadalcanal, and Leyte, the name Langley began to disappear from headlines. The new Yorktown class, Essex class, and later nuclear supercarriers eclipsed her modest figure. Her wooden deck, so revolutionary in its time, seemed almost primitive compared to the enormous steel platforms that would dominate the ocean. However, among historians and veterans, a deep recognition persisted. Without the Langley, none of those ships would have existed. She had been the laboratory where the procedures that allowed aircraft carriers to become the most powerful weapon of the 20th century were developed. Her legacy was inscribed in every operations manual, in every deck signal, in every aircraft launch and recovery. As the decades passed, most of the survivors aged in silence, carrying with them fragmented memories of the day the Langley was lost. Many never spoke of it, either due to trauma, humility, or because no one seemed interested in listening. The families of the 16 sailors who died in the attack lived with uncertainty, without a grave to visit or remains to honor. For them, the sea became an invisible cemetery where mourning had no physical place to hold on to. Yellowed photographs kept in, drawers, letters written from the sea, and medals delivered without a body were the only vestiges of those who never returned. Academic interest in the Langley slowly resurfaced in the second half of the 20th century, when researchers began re-evaluating the development of naval aviation. Previously classified documents were declassified, allowing part of the ship's history to be reconstructed. However, the exact location of her wreck remained a huge mystery. Navigation charts from the time were imprecise. Many Japanese reports had been destroyed, and Allied records contained contradictory coordinates. In addition, the seabed of the Java Sea is extremely complex. Strong currents, shifting sediments, and multiple wartime wrecks scattered around the area made any systematic search attempt difficult. Each expedition returned with more doubts than answers. In the 1980s and 1990s, diving teams and underwater archaeology groups attempted to locate the Langley using technologies then considered advanced, such as side-scan sonar. But the devices were limited in resolution, and the exact depth made any direct exploration difficult. Several times they believed they had found the wreck, only to discover that the remains belonged to sunken merchant ships or other military vessels from the same campaign. Over time, the search began to seem useless, a romantic obsession without tangible results. The sea, silent and relentless, continued to guard its secret. But as technology evolved, so did the possibilities for success. In the early 21st century, advances in underwater mapping allowed previously inaccessible areas to be explored. International teams began to collaborate, combining resources that no country could provide on its own. Interest in locating historic shipwrecks increased thanks to spectacular discoveries such as the Titanic, the Bismarck, and the USS Indianapolis. Each find demonstrated that the ocean, although vast, could reveal its treasures with patience and the right tools. It was in this context that the 2017 expedition emerged. Unlike previous searches, this one was based on a rigorous methodological approach. They analyzed historical ocean currents, reconstructed the trajectories of escort ships, reinterpreted Japanese bombing records, and combined everything with digital drift modeling. The result was a suspect area much smaller than any previous attempt. The vessel MV Mermaid Sapphire, equipped with state-of-the-art instruments, became the ideal platform for this mission. The researchers began the expedition aware that they might return empty-handed, but also convinced that it was the best opportunity in decades. When the multi-beam sonar began mapping the seafloor, the first readings showed nothing relevant: rocky formations, sandy depressions, scattered metallic debris with no defined shape. The team remained calm, following a carefully established plan. But then, a different image appeared on the screen. A long, straight, symmetrical structure, very different from merchant wrecks or ships destroyed by internal explosions. It was a silhouette too perfect, too aligned to be a geological accident. The technicians adjusted parameters, conducted new passes, and the figure repeated itself with increasing clarity. Excitement began to spread through the control room. It could be her. The decision to deploy the remotely operated vehicle was immediate. As the ROV descended, the tension was palpable. The cameras first showed absolute darkness, then suspended particles, then shadows, suggesting relief. Suddenly, the beam of light illuminated a metallic surface covered in marine incrustations. The shape of a hull slowly emerged, eroded but recognizable. As they advanced, indisputable details appeared: the remains of the aircraft elevator, lateral reinforcements characteristic of the original design, fragments of structure that matched the plans from Jupiter's conversion to Langley. Silence in the control room was total. There was no doubt. When the ROV captured images of the collapsed hangar outline, the team understood the magnitude of the discovery. They had not only located the first American aircraft carrier, they had found the tangible origin of an entire naval doctrine. The emotion was such that some team members confessed to having cried upon seeing the visual confirmation. It was not simply a sunken ship. It was history, sacrifice, and progress encapsulated in steel and coral. Official confirmation arrived after an exhaustive analysis of the images and comparisons with naval records. experts concluded that it could not be any other ship. The Langley had finally been found. The public announcement of the discovery resonated not only among military historians and underwater archaeology enthusiasts, it also deeply affected the families of those men who had disappeared in 1942. Many descendants had never had a grave to visit, nor a physical place to pay homage. For generations, the memory of the Langley's sailors had been passed down only through black and white photographs, fragmented stories, and medals stored in cardboard boxes. When the news of the discovery reached their homes, the predominant feeling was not only sadness or nostalgia, but an unexpected sense of peace. For the first time, there was a point on the map, a real place where their loved ones rested. For many families, it was like closing a book that had remained open for far too long. In later interviews, several relatives confessed that the discovery allowed them to reconstruct a part of their personal identity. Some had grown up hearing stories about a grandfather or uncle who had disappeared at sea, but without understanding the historical context or the magnitude of the sacrifice. Now, with images of the wreck resting silently on the ocean floor, they could imagine the final chapter of those interrupted lives, not as a void, but as an act of service during a critical moment in world history. The discovery transformed the family narrative of unexplained loss into a legacy of honor. This emotional impact crossed borders. Not only Americans reacted to the discovery. In Indonesia, where the remains lie near traditional fishing routes, the find sparked cultural interest and respect toward a wreck that had remained an invisible ghost beneath their waters. In Australia, whose ships escorted the Langley and rescued most of the survivors, the discovery rekindled recognition of the military cooperation between both countries during the desperate early months of the war in the Pacific. Even in Japan, where the history of World War II remains a complex and sensitive subject, some naval historians acknowledged the academic value of locating and documenting such a significant wreck for understanding the early development of carrier warfare. Meanwhile, in the academic world, the discovery opened new lines of research. The remains of the Langley's hull revealed unexpected details about its condition at the time of sinking. Corrosion, although extensive, had preserved key parts of the structure, allowing experts to directly study the resistance of materials used in early naval conversions. The points where the Japanese bombs struck showed fracture patterns different from those observed in purpose-built aircraft carriers, confirming that the initial warnings of certain officers had had technical merit. A platform converted from a coal carrier had significant structural limitations when facing modern combat. However, what most caught the researchers' attention was the arrangement of certain internal remains of the hangar. The position of some destroyed aircraft suggested that the fire spread even faster than official reports indicated. This led to a re-evaluation of the vulnerability of early fuel and ammunition storage installations on experimental carriers. Some naval engineers stated that studying the wreck could provide valuable information for the safety of current ships, even in the era of nuclear carriers. Another fascinating element emerged when the ROV recorded personal items scattered among the remains. Fragments of helmets, hand tools, corroded uniform pieces, intact glass bottles, and remains of tablets with barely visible inscriptions. Each of those objects told a silent story. Some belonged to mechanics who had worked under constant pressure to keep the aircraft operational. Others were evidence of daily life on board: an enamel mug, a comb, an oil lamp repurposed as an improvised container. These details humanized the narrative, reminding us that the Langley was not only a technological experiment, but a space inhabited by men with routines, hopes, and fears. The site was officially declared a war grave, which means that direct human intervention is prohibited. No objects may be removed, nor may the wreck be excavated. This decision reflects a growing ethic within underwater archaeology. Military shipwrecks are no longer considered recoverable treasures, but sacred cemeteries, places where memory deserves absolute respect. The protection of the wreck also prevented a significant risk. Looting. In recent years, numerous World War II wrecks in Southeast Asia have been destroyed by illegal companies seeking high-quality steel for the metallurgical industry. Some historic ships have disappeared completely, dismantled piece by clandestine machinery. The rapid intervention of international organizations prevented that fate for the Langley. With the discovery confirmed and protected, an inevitable question arose within the historical community. What does the USS Langley really represent? Its story does not end with its sinking or with its discovery. Its meaning extends much further. For some, the Langley symbolizes the birth of a military doctrine that transformed the global balance of power. The aircraft carriers that dominated the battles of the Pacific, from Midway to Okinawa, descended directly from the lessons learned on her deck. For others, it represents the fragility of military innovation, a reminder that progress is often accompanied by human sacrifice and costly mistakes. And for a more intimate group of people, the Langley embodies the memory of loved ones lost in a dark chapter of history. The discovery of the Langley also triggered a change in how naval history is presented in museums and documentaries. Previously, many accounts began with more famous aircraft carriers, ignoring the experimental stage. After 2017, numerous institutions began incorporating the Langley's history as an essential starting point for understanding the evolution of naval aviation. The overdue recognition allowed decades of forgotten work to be revalued and gave credit to those pioneers who risked their lives when no one knew whether the aircraft carrier concept would work. The emotional connection to the find was reinforced by something unexpected: the clarity of the images obtained. Seeing the hull still aligned, the outline of the elevator, the shape of the hangar, made the past feel tangible. It was not a drawing in a book or a model in a museum. It was the real ship, still there, preserved in the darkness. The image of the hull resting on the seabed, surrounded by underwater fauna and flora, evoked a mix of solemnity and tragic beauty. Many viewers described the scene as an underwater cathedral, where the passage of time had conferred dignity upon the remains. Over time, the discovery of the wreck began to influence not only historical interpretation, but also the public perception of sacrifice during the Second World War. Documentaries, lectures, academic articles, and audiovisual productions took this find as a central point to explore the origins of modern naval air power. For the first time, millions of people learned the story of the Langley not as a footnote, but as the starting point of a military revolution. Her name began to appear alongside iconic aircraft carriers, such as USS Enterprise, USS Yorktown, and USS Hornet. The historical narrative stopped focusing exclusively on great victories and began to give space to experiments, failures, and sacrifices that made those triumphs possible. One of the most significant changes occurred within the United States Navy itself. In official ceremonies, speeches, and commemorative events, the Langley was mentioned as the mother of American aircraft carriers, a symbolic title that recognized her foundational role. Naval aviation schools began teaching specific modules about her legacy, showing images of the wreck and analyzing the risks taken by her crew in the early years of carrier aviation. For modern pilots, accustomed to operating from gigantic floating platforms with advanced technological assistance, the idea of taking off from a wooden deck on a converted ship seemed almost inconceivable. However, that historical reality reinforced a sense of professional continuity. Current operations did not emerge from nowhere, but from the effort and courage of those who flew from the Langley in the 1920s. There was also a renewed interest in the human aspects of the crew. Historians and genealogists began tracing the descendants of the sailors, seeking to reconstruct their personal stories. Some families possessed diaries with intimate descriptions of life on board, letters that captured raw emotions, and photographs showing everyday moments on deck. These documents made it possible to reveal details that had never been included in official accounts. Birthdays celebrated by improvising cakes with naval rations, friendly competitions between mechanics to see who could repair an engine faster, shared superstitions for protection before takeoffs, and even small acts of rebellion that broke the ship's rigid discipline. These fragments of humanity demonstrated that behind the technological innovation were ordinary men living extraordinary experiences. The discovery also opened an ethical debate about the treatment of military shipwrecks. Some argued that allowing controlled visits by underwater vehicles could encourage historical knowledge and keep the ship's memory alive. Others insisted that any intervention, even the slightest, constituted a lack of respect toward the deceased. In the end, the more conservative position prevailed. The Langley had to remain intact, protected from underwater tourism and commercial activities. This decision reflected a growing international recognition of military wrecks as sites of cultural and memorial heritage, not as exploitable resources. In the scientific field, the preservation of the wreck made it possible to study processes of corrosion and biological colonization on metallic structures submerged for decades. Marine organisms such as sponges, soft corals, and crustaceans had transformed parts of the hull into a complex ecosystem. The interaction between aged steel and marine life offered relevant information for studies on biomineralization and the restoration of artificial habitats on the ocean floor. Paradoxically, the wreck born of human conflict had become a refuge for marine species, inadvertently contributing to the area's biodiversity. Meanwhile, among military strategy experts, the story of the Langley began to serve as a historical warning. Her loss demonstrated that transformative technological innovations often face critical vulnerabilities in their early stages. The conversion of a collier into an aircraft carrier, ingenious as it was, could not fully compensate for the need for specialized design. In later conflicts, naval planners understood that the survival of an aircraft carrier depended not only on its offensive capacity, but also on its structural and defensive resilience. The rapid destruction of the Langley became an example of the dangers of employing experimental platforms under extreme conditions. However, this early vulnerability did not diminish her legacy. On the contrary, it added symbolic depth to her story. The Langley represented the inherent risk of progress. She was a reminder that advances which later seem inevitable arose from brave decisions made in moments of uncertainty. Her sacrifice was interpreted as the necessary price to achieve a naval dominance that would change the course of the war and the global balance of power. With the rise of public interest, specific commemorations in honor of the Langley began to be organized. Naval museums installed exhibits dedicated to the aircraft carrier, displaying detailed models, original blueprints, and personal testimonies. In some ceremonies, descendants of crew members cast wreaths into the sea, symbolizing a renewed bond between the families and the place where their loved ones rest. These actions, though symbolic, offered a tangible way to heal intergenerational wounds. Even popular culture was influenced. Books, historical novels, video games, and film productions began to include references to the Langley. For many, discovering her story was a revelation. The first American aircraft carrier was not an invincible giant, but a modest, experimental, imperfect, yet fundamental vessel. This reinterpretation humanized military history, moving it away from the glorification of imposing machines and bringing it closer to the reality of the human effort behind progress. Over time, the Langley's wreck began to acquire an almost mythical aura. For some divers and explorers, it represented the holy grail of Pacific shipwrecks. Its inaccessibility contributed to its legend, since only specialized vehicles could reach it. This inaccessible nature preserved its dignity and prevented the accelerated deterioration that affected other wrecks exposed to maritime traffic or looting. Meanwhile, researchers continued analyzing sonar data and visual records, seeking to more precisely understand the ship's final moments. Some damage patterns suggested that the spread of fire had been even faster than documented, possibly due to the presence of additional fuel stored near vulnerable areas. This hypothesis reinforced the importance of the lessons derived from the tragedy. Later aircraft carriers implemented safer designs, separating fuel and ammunition stores with reinforced compartments and advanced containment systems. The story of the Langley, far from being static, continues to evolve. Each new investigation contributes previously unknown details. Each recovered family account adds a human layer. Each scientific study reveals the wreck's ongoing impact on the marine ecosystem. Her legacy is not solely historical. It is dynamic, living, in constant reinterpretation. The strategic legacy of USS Langley did not take long to manifest beyond the strictly naval sphere. Her existence and subsequent loss influenced governmental, budgetary, and technological decisions on a scale that few of her builders could have imagined. After her sinking, the Navy Department used the tragedy as an argument to accelerate the construction of aircraft carriers designed from scratch, driving programs that until then had progressed cautiously due to economic constraints and internal debates. The question ceased to be whether aircraft carriers should replace battleships as the main core of the fleet, and became when and how quickly. The Battle of the Coral Sea, and especially Midway, confirmed that carrier aviation had definitively surpassed traditional gunnery power. However, those triumphs were only possible because the Langley had opened the way years earlier, demonstrating that an air fleet could operate from the sea, travel faster than guns, and strike where the enemy least expected it. In international strategic circles, the evaluation of the Langley became a case study. Japan, which had already observed American development with interest, integrated its own lessons into aircraft carriers, such as Akagi and Kaga, both initially converted from hulls intended for other purposes. Japanese planners recognized that American experiments had provided them with a useful reference, even though their designs would evolve in different directions. Europe, on the other hand, advanced more slowly. Some naval powers regarded aircraft carriers as auxiliary tools, not as the core of their forces. The Langley, in retrospect, showed that the North American strategic vision, although driven by necessity and economic limitations, had been the most accurate. The technological impact of the Langley was also felt in unforeseen areas. Her turboelectric propulsion system served as a model for future naval and civilian applications, inspiring developments in distributed power generation and energy efficiency in large vessels. In addition, the study of her structure after decades submerged provided crucial information about the durability of materials under extreme conditions. The corrosion of steel in saline environments and the interaction between different metals in the hull offered valuable data for modern marine engineering. What was once considered a risky experiment became, over time, an invaluable scientific resource. But perhaps the deepest aspect of her legacy lies in the human symbolism associated with the Langley. The ship represented a transition between two worlds, that of traditional warfare dominated by battleships, and that of modern warfare, where aviation would completely transform the nature of combat. That transition was not peaceful or linear. It was full of mistakes, sacrifices, and tragedies, and the Langley embodies that painful evolution. Her story shows that progress is not a straight path, but a succession of difficult decisions taken with incomplete information and under extreme pressure. Through her, we understand that behind every technological advance, there are individuals willing to risk everything for an idea that has not yet been validated. The recovery of its history has made it possible to highlight figures that had previously been relegated to brief mentions in military archives. Engineers who designed the first improvised catapults to assist in takeoffs, mechanics who managed to keep fragile aircraft operational during adverse weather conditions, officers who insisted on improving emergency procedures after fatal accidents. All of them contributed silently to the development of modern naval aviation. Today, their influence is recognized in automated flight control systems, deck safety protocols, and technologies for recovering damaged aircraft. One aspect that gained particular relevance after the discovery of the wreck was the comparison between official accounts and physical evidence. For decades, reports of the sinking presented a relatively orderly narrative. Air attack, uncontrolled fires, lethal flooding, disciplined evacuation, and final sinking after torpedo impacts fired by escorts. However, the position of certain remains suggests that the chaos was more extreme than publicly admitted. The distribution of metal fragments and structural remains indicates that some internal explosions occurred in rapid sequence, possibly trapping crew members in compartments they were unable to evacuate. This discovery does not seek to diminish the merit of the official accounts, but to complement them, offering a more complete and human view of the suffering experienced during the ship's final minutes. The emotional nature of the tragedy also led to reflection on the fragility of historical memory. For decades, the story of the Langley faded, overshadowed by larger-scale events. Had the wreck not been found, it is possible that its history would have continued to dissolve until disappearing completely from collective consciousness. The discovery acted as a temporal anchor, restoring its existence in the public imagination. Museums, educational institutions, and military organizations began integrating its story into commemorative and educational programs, ensuring that future generations understood the fundamental role of this humble naval experiment. The discovery also generated renewed respect for underwater archaeology as a scientific discipline. For a long time, shipwreck exploration was seen as an adventure activity rather than rigorous research. The case of the Langley demonstrated how the combination of advanced technology, precise historical studies, and international collaboration could produce extraordinary results with profound cultural implications. The use of multi-beam sonar, remotely operated vehicles, and comparative structural analysis made it possible to identify the wreck with a level of precision impossible in previous investigations. As research advanced, an inevitable reflection emerged regarding the contrast between the ship's original purpose and its final fate. The Langley was conceived as a platform for innovation, a tool to project power and transform the future of naval warfare. However, its remains now rest in silence, transformed into a marine sanctuary where underwater life thrives. Corals, fish, and benthic organisms occupy spaces where aircraft were once stored and combat missions prepared. This poetic irony has been highlighted by marine biologists who interpret the wreck as an example of how human destruction can give way, over time, to new ecosystems that enrich the natural environment. As the international naval community analyzed the deeper meaning of the discovery, a fundamental question resurfaced. To what extent did the existence of USS Langley influence the development of the aircraft carriers that would dominate the 20th and 21st centuries? The answer, assembled piece by piece by historians, engineers, and strategists, revealed a forceful truth. Without the Langley, naval aviation would not have evolved in the same way, nor with the same speed. Its technological impact was far more than experimental. It shaped the design, doctrine, and operational philosophy of practically every navy in the world. After its sinking, the United States Navy accelerated the construction of ships specifically designed to operate aircraft. The Lexington-class, and later the Yorktown-class aircraft carriers, directly incorporated lessons learned from the Langley: hangar layout, more efficient elevators, safer fuel distribution, and a reinforced deck capable of supporting heavier and faster aircraft. Even the concept of centralized flight control, now standard in modern aircraft carriers, was born on its deck, where officers developed manual signals and later light systems to guide pilots. Interestingly, its influence was not limited to the United States. Japan, closely observing each American development, transformed old battleship hulls into experimental aircraft carriers, inspired by the Langley's conversion. These decisions led to the creation of units such as Akagi and Kaga, which would play devastating roles in the early months of the war in the Pacific. The historical irony is evident. The architect of American naval aviation also indirectly fueled the development of the enemy that would temporarily dominate the ocean. Europe also began adopting the concept, although with less initial enthusiasm. The United Kingdom, with its experience in embarked aviation during the First World War, found in the Langley's history a confirmation of its own doctrine. France and Italy followed similar paths, each adapting ideas that originated from that pioneering platform. In this way, the Langley became a global catalyst for naval innovation. Over the years, its influence extended even beyond the military sphere. The idea of using mobile platforms to launch aircraft opened the door to the concept of strategic aerial mobility. Decades later, this philosophy would contribute to the development of floating air bases, missile launch platforms, and even futuristic projects such as mobile runways and orbital projection vessels. What began as an improvised experiment on a wooden deck ended up redefining the way humans conceive control of airspace. Meanwhile, on the seafloor, the wreck continued to transform. The Langley, in absolute silence, became a vibrant habitat. Marine biologists who studied the ROV images were astonished by the biodiversity that had colonized its structures. Giant sponges had grown over the corroded beams, creating shelters for small crustaceans. Schools of tropical fish moved through the openings of the collapsed hangar, and soft corals adhered to surfaces that once endured explosions and fire. Some researchers described the site as a metallic forest, where life had found a way to thrive in a setting born of destruction. This ecological transformation sparked profound philosophical reflections. The wreck, a symbol of war and death, had become a source of life. Where there had been explosions, there was now fertile silence. Where there had been smoke and fuel, delicate organisms now grew. Nature had reclaimed the structure, reinterpreting its straight lines and rigid compartments into an organic ecosystem. This phenomenon reinforced the notion that shipwrecks can play a positive role in the marine environment, acting as artificial reefs that promote environmental recovery in regions damaged by intensive fishing and pollution. However, this balance was fragile. Experts warned that irresponsible human presence could alter or destroy this underwater sanctuary. Therefore, the decision to legally protect the wreck not only honored the fallen, but also preserved a unique ecological microcosm. Culturally, the discovery revitalized a sense of connection with the past. In museums and educational centers, visitors could see images of the silent hull resting beneath the bluish ocean light. Some described the experience as moving, almost spiritual. The Langley was not just a historical relic, it was an emotional bridge between generations. Grandchildren and great-grandchildren of sailors who never met their ancestors could now visualize the place where those men faced their final moments. That emotional bond, reinforced by the tangibility of the discovery, turned history into something alive. The Langley's narrative also began to be used as an educational tool to teach about innovation, resilience, and international cooperation. Universities incorporated its history into courses on naval engineering, underwater archaeology, and military studies. Its example served to demonstrate how technological progress depends as much on creativity and boldness as on learning from failure. And beyond academia, its story resonated on a deeply human level. Each corroded steel plate, each rusty rivet, each fragment of the hangar told a silent story. Stories of sacrifice, of bravery, of irreversible mistakes and decisions made under pressure. Stories of everyday life on board, shared laughter, combat tension, hopes of returning home. Stories that, without the discovery of the wreck, might have disappeared forever. The global doctrinal impact of USS Langley deepened even further when strategists began comparing its history with that of other pioneering aircraft carriers and recent major underwater discoveries, especially those of the carriers USS Hornet and USS Wahoo. Each of these wrecks represents a different chapter in naval evolution, but only the Langley symbolizes the conceptual birth of the entire system. While the Hornet and the Wahoo are seen as examples of operational perfection or combat bravery, the Langley is understood as the uncertain, risky, experimental first step that sparked an irreversible transformation in global maritime power. That unique position made it an inevitable reference point for any serious historical analysis of the development of the modern aircraft carrier. Unlike the Hornet, which was built from the beginning as a large-scale offensive war instrument, the Langley was born from an improvised conversion. That improvisation forced designers and operators to confront problems that did not exist in ships designed from scratch. How do you store aviation fuel safely? How do you move aircraft in a limited space? How do you ensure that an airplane can take off from such a short deck? These questions, answered through trial and error, laid the foundations for solutions that would later be refined in subsequent aircraft carriers. The Hornet inherited already established operational procedures, while the Langley had to invent them. This difference became fundamental to understanding military innovation. Progress rarely emerges from perfect machines from the outset, but from imperfect prototypes that reveal real challenges. The Langley demonstrated that technological audacity requires accepting failures, correcting them, and moving forward. Its sinking, far from invalidating the aircraft carrier concept, accelerated its evolution. In comparison with the Wahoo, whose fame is based on its tactical aggressiveness and the mystery of its disappearance, the Langley represents a different kind of emotional legacy. The Wahoo symbolizes sacrifice in direct combat, the courage to attack relentlessly in enemy waters. Its discovery was interpreted as the recovery of a fallen warrior. The Langley, on the other hand, symbolizes the vulnerability of innovation, the silent cost of the experiments that precede major victories. While the Wahoo is seen as a fallen hero, the Langley is perceived as a predecessor that never had the opportunity to fully demonstrate its potential in open warfare. That emotional difference led to deep reflections. It became understood that, in military narratives, recognition is far more easily granted to those who achieve visible glory, but rarely to those who build the foundations upon which that glory becomes possible. The recovery of the Langley allowed that historical injustice to be partially corrected. Its influence on modern nuclear aircraft carriers also became a topic of study. Although the technologies seem incomparably different, a wooden deck on a converted hull versus gigantic floating cities powered by nuclear reactors, the doctrinal similarities are surprising. The basic concept remains the same: a mobile platform capable of projecting air power to any point on the planet. The organizational structure of the deck, air traffic control, aircraft maintenance and recovery procedures, and even the professional culture of naval aviators have direct roots in the Langley's early experiments. In fact, contemporary officers have pointed out that every takeoff from a modern nuclear aircraft carrier carries with it a symbolic element: continuity with those first daring flights from an improvised deck. It is an invisible tradition, but one deeply ingrained. The symbolic transformation of the wreck into a living monument reached an unexpected dimension when ROV images began circulating, showing fish swimming between beams, corals growing over structural reinforcements, and rays of light filtering through corroded steel. These scenes evoked an almost spiritual feeling in some observers. What was once an instrument of destruction was now a sanctuary of life. That contrast led to poetic and philosophical interpretations about the ocean's ability to absorb human tragedies and return beauty. In some commemorative ceremonies, veterans and relatives described the wreck as a garden of steel, a metaphor that captured the duality of its existence: memory and renewal coexisting in the same space. The presence of personal objects in the wreck added an even deeper emotional layer. A pair of rusted binoculars, a belt with a still visible buckle, remnants of boots, fragments of naval crockery. All of them told silent stories of interrupted lives. Some archaeologists claim to have felt a profound responsibility when observing those objects, as if they were facing direct testimony from individuals who never had the opportunity to tell their version of events. This human component led to the development of educational programs focused on individual memory within military history. It was no longer just about studying battles and strategies, but about understanding the lives affected by them. The Langley became an ideal vehicle to convey that perspective, especially to younger generations. Additionally, its discovery prompted discussions about the preservation of other historical shipwrecks. Countries with World War II wrecks under their jurisdiction began implementing stricter regulations to protect them from looters and illegal metal recovery companies. In some cases, the example of the Langley was cited explicitly as justification for new laws. The comparison with other emblematic shipwrecks in the world, such as the Titanic, the Bismarck, or the USS Indianapolis, allowed the cultural significance of USS Langley to be further contextualized. Each of those wrecks represents a different type of tragedy and collective memory. The Titanic symbolizes the clash between human arrogance and nature. The Bismarck embodies military pride and its overwhelming destruction. The Indianapolis became marked by one of the most terrifying survival stories in naval history. But the Langley, by contrast, occupies a different space. It was not a symbol of luxury or absolute power, nor the setting of a massive survival drama. Its image is associated with the silent beginning of a technological revolution, a tragedy that did not capture global attention at the time, but that over time proved to be the point where a transformation began that would define the course of the war and of the century. Unlike the Titanic, whose story was known around the world from the very first day, the Langley sank almost in silence, on a distant front, at a moment when global chaos eclipsed any other news. Its disappearance did not generate massive headlines or immediate investigations. It was absorbed by military urgency. There were no famous passenger lists, no dramatic accounts of ocean liners breaking in two, no artists or magnates on board. What there was a group of men carrying out an apparently routine mission, defending an idea that was still not fully understood. And that contrast gave it a profoundly human character. The story of those who build the future without receiving recognition in life. The Bismarck, for its part, was sought for decades as a symbol of German naval pride. Its discovery was celebrated as an archaeological and technological triumph.